So the author for today, Immanuel Kant, is unquestionably one of the biggest names in philosophy. Wrote about a number of areas of philosophy. But the one that we're going to be focusing on today is his moral philosophy. And there's a lot of overlap between morality and ethics. If it comes up during class, we could talk a little bit about the distinction between the two. But I think we've already seen a number of examples of philosophical ethics. And I think one impression that sometimes happens, especially the first time encountering these authors who are definitely not easy, is a philosopher will seem to kind of dance around their point and spend so much space going into detail about their arguments that it can become unclear just what it is that they're trying to convey, at least on a first or even second reading. Whatever one can say about Kant on the negative side, you can't accuse him of not being direct. I think one of the sort of virtues of his moral philosophy is that he is very blunt about what he thinks morality is. And it comes down to something kind of key takeaway for class today, I hope, is that's called the categorical imperative. Like, he has lots of great and in ways beautiful arguments to build up to his idea of morality, but he is someone who will give you in literally one sentence what he considers moral law to be. There will be variations of that sentence, what are often called formulations of the categorical imperative. But Kant is very direct in what he thinks moral law is. And a lot of times, the first time encountering Kant, even though he has that virtue, I would say, of directness, some of his vocabulary is just tricky to deal with. But what I would suggest is that once we can familiarize ourselves a little bit with his vocabulary, which is pretty unique, and become comfortable using Kantian terminology, we'll be able to unearth what the categorical imperative means and see it for this very blunt, direct assertion of what morality is. So to start to talk about the categorical imperative, I mean, it's essentially a universal law for what moral conduct is. But one thing that makes Kant, you could almost say, revolutionary about the way he describes that law is that he refuses to take recourse to history or the Bible or any outside source. He comes from a wider tradition that's been asking for hundreds of years, going back to Aristotle and before, are there moral rules for human conduct? One thing that will distinguish Kant is that he'll insist on looking to no source other than human reason alone. And that kind of approach is considered characteristic, or really one of the main examples for the period that he was part of and in many ways helped create, namely the Enlightenment. So who on the call would care to share what the Enlightenment is? Maybe you've encountered it in a previous class before.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
What was the Enlightenment?
It was generally a period, like, wasn't it post Middle Ages? Like, it was like around the time where, like, a lot of, I guess it was a lot of more of, I would say, what's the word, like more existential, like, thought going around.
Yeah, I would
As
hold on.
opposed to, like, more like, I wouldn't say religious like zealotry, but like more of thinking of like self as opposed to thinking of, I guess, as things ordained by God or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll ask, let's put off using the word existential for now, because in a context of philosophy, existentialism is a whole school of thought unto itself that's really more in the 20th century. But I like what you had to say about drawing a distinction between, the Middle Ages, very rooted in respecting divine law, and a theme that emerges in the Enlightenment, thanks in large part to thinkers like Kant, that emphasizes human dignity and human individuality. So some comments in the chat are from Maya. It's a time period where science started. I mean, I think that's the right idea. My only modification to that would be, science had been going on for a while, but it seems to pick up in a new sense and never stop since then. Jeffrey wrote, it's a time where people were becoming more knowledgeable. I think that's a great characterization of the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment was it was caused by like a lot of ideas that were building in during like the time of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation. A lot of people think of it as like the time where like reasoning and just individualism kind of came out.
Yeah, absolutely. An age of reason is sometimes taken to be a synonym for the Enlightenment. And individuality, the dignity of the human being, is another key theme. I didn't talk too much about Locke in his Enlightenment context last week, but he would be considered another Enlightenment philosopher, and his kind of theory of rights and arguing that humans have a certain, inherent dignity and worth would be a very characteristic thought of the Enlightenment. Kant himself, like other Enlightenment philosophers, was very self-conscious, self-aware about the time he was writing in, and his own description of his time comes in a short, famous essay called What is Enlightenment? And it begins, Enlightenment is man's exit from his self-incurred minority. Minority is the incapacity to use one's intelligence without the guidance of another. Such minority is self-incurred if it is not caused by lack of intelligence, but by lack of determination and courage to use one's intelligence without being guided by another. Saper aude, Latin phrase meaning dare to know. Have the courage to use your own intelligence is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. So I think I liked a lot of what I was hearing about some of the key themes, which sounded right to me about the time Kant was living in. But that's his own interpretation, that during his day, human beings are exiting a sort of self-imposed state of intellectual immaturity and daring to think on their own. And in the context of his moral philosophy, there's a kind of human self-sufficiency on a very fundamental level. Kant will say you no longer need to look to an outside authority like the Bible or what monarchs tell you, but human beings create morality for themselves, and the challenge for philosophers to unearth what that is. So I think I'm going to fire up the slides to say a few more introductory kind of comments about Kant before getting to the reading for today, which comes from one of his books called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. See if you can bear with me one moment. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. And let me know if you can't. So Kant, as I was starting to say, is a major figure in history of philosophy. really because he wrote exhaustively on topics not consigned, not limited to just moral philosophy, but also a big focus of his life's work was epistemology, a word we've encountered before. That's kind of philosophical study of what are the limits of knowledge and how knowledge is attained. And Kant wrote 3 books known as critiques that you'll often find taught to this day in philosophy departments. That we're not reading anything from them for this class, but should you take a philosophy class again, wouldn't be surprised if you encountered his major works. 3 volumes, multiple hundreds of pages each. They are very serious works. But one unifying theme for them is they are Kant's project to seek the grounds of human knowledge by looking to human faculties. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant inquired into a faculty of experiential knowledge, which tries to ground a science of nature. And it's in that book that he launched what's often called his Copernican revolution. So to give a bit more perspective on Kant's approach to moral philosophy, I think it helps to keep in mind what he was trying to do in the Critique of Pure Reason, which has been characterized. Kant argued the mind is so structured that it imposes interpretive categories on our experience, so that we do not simply interpret the world, but interpret it through the categorizing mechanisms of the mind. This theory is sometimes called Kant's Copernican revolution, for just as Copernicus showed that it was not the sun that revolved around the earth, but vice versa, that the earth moved around the sun, likewise Kant showed that it was not the world that caused us to experience things the way we do, but the categories of the mind that caused us to experience the world and everything else the way we do. So Kant took this to be a revolution in thought, kind of shifting emphasis from trying to understand the outside world in an empirical way through gathering data, and instead, in a sense, looking inward and trying to understand the structure of the mind. And since he's interested in pretty much all major areas of philosophy, he'll look at the structure of the mind and how it applies to not only the science of the natural world, but also to aesthetics. In the 3rd critique, called the Critique of Judgment, he'll talk at great length about beauty. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant tries to give the grounds for moral action. And for each of the critiques, he also sort of prefaced them with a short metaphysical work, trying to uncover what faculties human beings possessed that make science and moral experience possible. So the work that we're going to talk about today, the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, focuses on the human faculties that go into moral decision making. And just a few more words about the kind of mental faculties Kant has in mind. For Kant, he wants to look at the categories in the mind instead of the outside world to ground things like science of the natural world or a hypothetical science of moral behavior, because he seems to think that it's only by referring to things outside of the world of experience. The term that comes up throughout his text, including the one for today, is a priori, happening before experience, because things that we experience on a day-to-day basis are just not reliable to base either scientific laws or moral laws upon. And so a very striking aspect of the moral law that Kant eventually uncovers And I think it's because he's basing it on the fundamental structure of the mind, is his contention that the moral law is universal. It applies to all rational beings in all places for all time. And that's a very bold claim to make. And I think it also kind of flies in the face of more contemporary views, which we've discussed, earlier in the class, that would maintain morality is a matter of culture or upbringing or any other number of factors. There are no moral absolutes. There is not a universal law. Kant is basically the opposite of that view. And as strange as it may seem to encounter an author who claims to have found a moral law that applies universally with no exceptions, I think we could start to appreciate how that might not be so ridiculous when we think about our own moral experiences. So as abstract as Kant is, I think it's helpful to always try to bear in mind how it might apply to the world that we all know and live in. And it's a very specific experience, I think, might start to get us to see how the idea of a universal moral law is not on its face absurd. Is, if you can think of a time where you're considering doing something and find yourself thinking, I should not do this. Happens all the time. For my part, I can think back to high school, hang out with buddies after class, and someone decides to steal from a shop, like a candy bar or something like that. Sometimes these, hopefully that's not too corny. They're probably more innocent and less innocent examples, but one experience that I remember at the time was a thought, maybe a feeling on some level, I should not do that. I would feel guilty if I did that. I think from a Kantian point of view, that kind of experience of being told on an inward level by myself that I should or should not do something is a kind of symptom for a universal moral law. Before I move on, can anyone else think of any examples?
Like a moral law?
What's an example of a moral situation
Uh,
where you found yourself saying I should or should not do something?
I guess the easiest one I could think of is like, it's probably a popular one now, but like, when you go like grocery shopping or something and you have the shopping cart, like, do you like, should you or should you not like put it back where you found it?
Right. Yeah. A full cart or an empty cart?
Empty cart.
Okay, yeah.
Like if you're using it and you're done with it, should you or should you not like bring it back?
Yeah, absolutely. Basic responsibilities like that. What's the answer?
Well, I generally put it back.
Right. And why?
Uh, I guess because I don't know, I'd rather not inconvenience the person working. Well, even though I know they get paid to do it, I don't really want to inconvenience the person that works there. It's sort of like, also at a restaurant, you don't really want to make a mess like
Mhm.
you're eating.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a great example. But then the question is, where do you get that sense of should from? Is it just the culture we live in, how you were raised, or I mean, maybe it's something we could return to at the end of class. Is there is there a moral code or a moral law? And the other
Um,
question might be,
oh,
do you allow for exceptions allowed in the kind of example that you're mentioning, Alan? Is it okay to return a shopping cart some of the time, but not all the time? Should it be most of the time, or is it something that happens without exception?
It's I guess it's more of a person to person sort of thing, really.
Got it. So it's case by case, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's a great example.
An example that I can think about is like, let's say you found like $20 on the floor. Like you just passed by, not passed by, but like you just found it and there's nobody around. So is it like, do you take that $20 or do you not take it? Like it's not yours, but then again, if you don't take it, nobody else will. But at the same time, you don't know if someone's coming back to get that $20. But then again, so if you don't take it and someone else doesn't take their $20 that they dropped, somebody else could take it. So then it's like, okay, well, another stranger would be doing it if I don't do
Sure.
it.
Yeah, I think that's another great example. So how do you decide whether do you take the $20 or not?
Um, you're asking, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. So if you don't have an immediate answer, that's perfectly fine. But what comes to mind? How do you decide whether or not to take the $20?
I don't know. I feel like for me, I just put it in the side, and then if anybody comes in to like look for it, I'd give it to them. And then I don't know. I guess put the money somewhere that I don't know, like like tip jar or something like that. Like put it somewhere
Right.
in there. But
Okay.
I don't know.
Got it. So you try to facilitate that the money be returned to its rightful owner, which I think that's a
Yeah.
very admirable thing. But why do that? Do you have to? And if not, why not?
I don't have to do it. I guess like I don't know. Like, I guess I'm not gonna lie and say I'm not tempted to take the money because then I'd be like a hypocrite in saying that I don't think about taking it. But I don't know. I feel like, see, for me, I guess it goes back to like religiously, that would be my mindset. But then again, what if the person isn't religious? So then what would they do? So it's complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very complicated. And yeah, how are we supposed to figure out, are there exceptions to these kind of rules we seem to have in mind when we're in a situation confronted with money we could take or not take? A shopping cart in a grocery store, do we return it or not? Another one of my favorite examples, this has come up in previous classes, is taking the bus or the subway. Do you pay the fare or not? If yes, why yes? And if not, why not? Okay, so Basmala wrote in the chat, it depends on the setting. Edwin, I think, I think the spirit of Edwin's comment is similar: culture and society norms.
Uh, well, for me in the bus or train scenario, I think in the bus scenario, I would always pay because I have like because you have the presence of like someone like actually looking at you, like as opposed to like, and also they could just be like, get off the bus because you're not paying. But
Right.
also on the train, it's sort of like a lot of times no man's land, so you could just hop the turnstile.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
like for me, like at least on the train, it's sort of difficult now because the job I have, they actually like they do background checks, and even if
Mhm.
it's like a misdemeanor or something, they'll be like, "Why is this here?" So I can't really do anything to get me ticketed.
Right.
If it
Yeah.
weren't working, I would literally just keep hopping the turnstile because I have no reason to pay.
Yeah. I think it's a tricky one because it's pretty easy to get away with not paying
Yeah,
fare. But then the question is, if we do pay the fare, why is it? Is it because we it's something society kind of expects of us, and there will be bad consequences if we don't pay? Such as, yeah, I mean, that'd be a total pain if it's brought to your employer's attention or something. Um, or I would be, if I go on the bus and the bus driver says, "Get off, you didn't pay." I mean, that'd be really embarrassing to me. um, I think what to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, Kant will argue that, and I see your Samurai Sam, we'll get to in 1 second. Kant will argue that the universal moral law must be followed out of duty to that law and duty alone, and that's the only gauge of moral worth of an action, and that all the millions of other factors that may go into a particular moral decision will it help or hurt me? Will it help or hurt someone else? Are totally irrelevant to the moral value of a decision, which is a pretty severe thing to say. I think we'll see as the discussion goes along. But I'm glad it, Alan, you brought up the factor that goes into any moral decision. It seems unavoidably that, to the point, our decisions have consequences. Kant will say we have to ignore the consequences when evaluating the moral worth of something. So Sam, I saw your hand raise. Is there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, previously I was going to say something about like the bus and train thing. But I just wanted to ask a general question. Like, I think in terms of Kant, does he just mean like we follow the rules because they're rules and we feel bad if we broke the rules?
It's an interesting way of putting it. I think what he will say is actually yes to the first part of what you said, but no to the second part. His phrasing will be a little bit different, and we'll get to in a little bit his concept of goodwill.
Okay, so
because
it's like highly. It's sorry. It's just very societal. He means like.
No, he's trying to put morality outside of a context of personal preferences or social customs. And so with the first part of what you said, you follow the rules because they're rules. I think that's a decent paraphrase of Kant's moral philosophy. What gives it a bit more heft is because he'll end up saying moral law must be followed out of duty and duty alone. I think it's duty is the kind of activation of what he terms goodwill, which is like the key to, or it's one of the keys to his whole moral philosophy. It's a worth of a human, there's nothing more valuable or precious than goodwill of a human being. And to do actions with moral worth, they will only acquire worth if one has the goodwill to follow the duty to do those actions, which is a bit convoluted. Hopefully it'll become, we've gotten a bit ahead of ourselves, but I think your phrasing, Sam, your phrasing brought up like the kind of core of Kant's moral philosophy. But the second half of what you said, that we shouldn't do things if they would be harmful, Kant would reject, because he'll insist that it is only adherence to duty, which to me seems rooted in having goodwill, that gives it actual moral worth. And you actually have to disregard the consequences, whether good or bad, of a particular action when evaluating moral worth.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Like, we follow the duties because they're duties, but not because we're thinking like, oh, well, if I hop the train style, then maybe nothing will happen to me and it'll be fine. But just being like, well, I have to pay the fare because we pay the fare. That's what people do.
Yeah.
Okay.
The first one sounds, your first sort of paraphrase of the situation sounds like something Kant might approve of. The second one, no, we should not just do things like avoid fare jumping because it's society frowns on them. It would be more because if there is a duty,
right,
things like pay fare, which I think Kant would say there actually is, which we can maybe get back to, then we have to do it out of a sense of duty. But yeah, so I mean, basically the key themes for today have already come up, but we have more to say about them. And we've already talked a bit about some examples, but these are, we need to go through all of these, but I want to kind of put on the table the 4 scenarios that actually toward the end of the reading for today, to me, really give life to Kant's moral philosophy. And actually the way he answers these questions yields to specific concrete duties. So even though there's only one key moral law, it turns out, according to Kant, to kind of prescribe a range of duties. So for the examples we were thinking of earlier, returning the cart back or not, giving money back to someone who lost it or not, fair jumping or not. There seems to be all kinds of outside factors. But I wonder if when we look at these questions, are there any internal factors, things that, as Kant would say, could be based on reason alone, would enable us to answer these questions? Okay, so the first one was pretty grim. Someone is wary of life. Why shouldn't he or she take their own life? I think the second one, maybe we could talk about, it's a little bit related to the money question that just came up. Someone needs money and considers taking out a loan and promising to repay it even though he or she knows they can't. Why shouldn't they?
I think it's sort of it sort of like goes back to the question of, well, not the question, but like the scenario of like a person that's like stealing, where like they're not concerned about like the future or whatever. They're more concerned about like the immediate consequences. Like if I don't get this money now, I'll die, as opposed to, oh, let me just wait like, I don't know, a month or two or something.
Yeah. But even so, I think we could get, I think it's what you raised is an important factor, short-term versus long-term consequences. And we can imagine, this second scenario playing out in the short term or long term. Let's say the loan and the repayment is due. Usually you get some time to repay a loan, but it could be either super short term. There's like payday loans, right? Where someone charges an insanely high rate and then you have to start paying back basically right away. Or there are also long-term loans, like college loans. So is there a way we can remove the kind of time factor and just answer this question without reference to outside things? And if so, how would we do that?
I really can't think of anything right now where that would, I don't know, like I feel like if there's no consequence, then you would just do it regardless.
Sure. Is there any reason why maybe one should not?
Probably just be like a poor judge on their character or something. Like they'll just look like they're greedy or just want more than they actually need.
But I can also think of examples, and maybe all of you can too, where it seems unfair to have to pay back a loan. There's a huge debate for years now about college loans specifically.
Yeah.
And there's thousands, if not millions of people who took out huge loans. They can't pay them back. They just.
Okay, then yeah. Funny enough, I was actually gonna use an example like that, but for like back to the train things where I feel like I'm not like horribly morally obligated to like pay for a fare on the trains if like they're always delayed.
Sure.
It's like never, the stations are like never clean or anything.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's riding the train is not a joy. The MTA doesn't seem to be holding its end of the deal by providing decent service and clean.
Yeah, while also increasing the fares.
Yeah, and increases fares incessantly. So why should we pay them? So, as a spoiler, I think Kant will say, yes, you do have to repay all of your loans. Yes, you do have to always pay the fare, but he's going to have a very unique reason for why that is. And it's up to us to see if we agree or disagree, or if we think he's persuasive. The last two examples here I think are, the third one is a tricky one for me. The fourth one less so. But is there a moral dimension when looking at questions 3 when you consider cultivating one's talent? Is a strange idea, but Kant puts it on the table in this reading. Someone has a special talent, but would rather enjoy life than cultivate that talent. Why should or shouldn't they? Is there a duty? Is this even a moral question? Is there a duty to cultivate one's talent? Don't want to spend too much time on this one because I do want to move on. But if an example could be, high schooler has a natural talent for math, but for whatever reason decides not to do it, doesn't want to go to college, wants to work instead and make money right away. That actually seems like a perfectly great thing to do in life, in my opinion. His moral philosophy will end up stating that if someone has a special talent for math, he or she should cultivate it and not neglect it. That's a tricky one. I think the fourth one might be more familiar from day-to-day experience. Someone is well off and could help others who are struggling. Why should they? And I think Kant's answer will sound a lot like the so-called golden rule, do unto others as they do unto you, but it'll be different in an important way. So started to say that Kant's moral philosophy is very much a matter of duty, and he understands the universal moral law as a matter of following one's duty. But duty in and of itself may not get you over the finish line. It doesn't seem like it is necessarily enough. So Kant also in the reading, both for today and throughout the entirety of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, insists that you can't look to factors that are external, outside of reason, to try to establish a moral law. So there might be, there's something in a sense that makes his morality very abstract. When we talk about examples, of moral decisions, what immediately comes up are all the factors, related to desires and consequences that unavoidably come up when you're talking about the real world. But Kant, going back to the earlier slides, because he's interested in knowledge on the basis of reason alone, he's interested in scientific knowledge that's based on pure reason without recourse to the outside world. In the moral realm, he wants to see if there's a moral law that could be based on reason alone. That requires him to exclude all the kind of outside, but what we would still call real world factors that go into moral decision making. I said you cannot evaluate, one of the previous questions on the basis of whether it helps or hurts you. Is taking out a loan and repaying it or not. He would say if you only repay the loan because you're afraid of the consequences, you'll get bad credit and all kinds of other very inconvenient things. The decision was not taken in a morally worthy way if you're just trying to avoid negative consequences. But he'll say, again, because he's looking to establish things on the basis of reason alone, even if you take a decision that appears to be morally worthy because it has positive consequences for you and other people, that also does not make that action truly morally worthy. So looking at the sort of fourth case, someone is well off and could help others who are struggling. Let's say someone does say, yes, I have extra income, so I'm going to give it to, whatever charity, because that will have good consequences for my community or something. Kant is so insistent on trying to establish a moral law on the basis of reason alone that he'll say even desiring something that seems so good, like wanting to help others in your community, is not what makes an action morally worthy. Which again, this seems very sort of stern and austere to me. Maybe it does to you too, or tell me if it makes perfect sense, or if you think it's nonsense. And as severe as that approach may seem, I think he's also onto something when he says, I don't think it's in the excerpts for today, but it's another statement he makes throughout the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which is, just a practical dimension to trying to uncover moral law, because you can't look to day-to-day experience or things like figuring out someone's motivations, hopes for a good thing or hopes to avoid a bad thing, because it's actually impossible. There will always be a reason to second guess someone's motivations. And I'm sure it's probably not too hard for us to think of examples of that ourselves. Someone donates to charity and says they want to do that in order to help their community, but there are also factors like, they get to post on social media and get 50 likes or whatever. I'm trying to think of other similar examples. Working overtime at the job without being paid, or that's not really a great example. Some companies encourage their employees to volunteer at a community center or whatever. Maybe, the person who does it, that seems like a pretty clear-cut case of doing a seemingly morally worthy thing, but for dubious motivations. So basically, what we're trying to get at is that Kant shows there's, in the world of day-to-day experience, there's just a seemingly endless kind of galaxy of potentially conflicting motivations, and you never really know, you can never really nail down what motivated someone to do something. So that's why he'll look to a basis of pure reason and try to see if that can motivate a moral law. I'm just gonna look at the chat momentarily. Okay, Edwin, I see your comments. I think you're talking about something that we were talking about a few minutes ago that I'm only just getting into now. So if you want to clarify what you meant, please go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the idea of goodwill.
Oh no, Professor, I was answering to this, I think was the third question on this slide before, that it says that someone has a special talent, but will rather enjoy that than cultivating the talent. I was trying to make that comment to that.
Okay. And your thought was, I'm saying yes.
Yeah. That they are that's their choice, and I think it won't affect society or neither the norms, even though maybe some people will try to implement like, you should try this is, you're doing well on that, but they might even have some more interest on other stuff. So I feel it's a choice. No, they have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very widespread view now, and I'm inclined to say the same thing. You can't force someone to cultivate their talents. So if we hold on to that, we'll see if we can get why Kant will say you and I are wrong, and people who do have a special talent are responsible to cultivate it. Because I do agree with you on that, Edwin, or I think I do, but Kant will disagree with us. So early in the reading for today, Kant writes a good amount about what he calls goodwill. So he's not going to look to any inclination or hope for an outcome of an action, or really anything in the external world at all, it seems, but we'll focus instead on goodwill as the kind of touchstone for his morality. And what Kant states is, early in the reading, goodwill is good not because of what it performs or affects, nor by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition, the act of will. that it is good in itself, and considered by itself to be esteemed much higher than all that can be brought about by it in favor of any inclination, even if it should happen that, owing to special disfavor of fortune, or a meager provision of a stepmotherly nature, this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest effort it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, then, like a jewel, it would shine still by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. So I think one paraphrase of that is, even if a good will doesn't lead to anything that's in any sense positive, it is still, just the greatest attribute one can possess, would be one way to phrase it. And I think that this becomes a foundation for Kant's morality, because even though the moral law is all about executing duties, I think, and this is not explicit in Kant, the connection between goodwill and duty, or at least it's not explicit to me. Goodwill is what makes someone able to and disposed to carrying out one's duties. So taking a bit of a step back, I think what might help put this in focus, and I do have some trouble with this concept of goodwill myself and understanding why Kant makes it so central to his moral philosophy, but we can contrast it with some of the other writers who've dealt with similar topics so far in this semester have had to say. For Aristotle in particular, he's in his ethical system, who's very concerned with virtue. It turns out that he's very concerned with the beautiful. Those are the kind of touchstones, it seems, for Aristotle's ethical philosophy. But Kant has a somewhat different emphasis from the start. Whereas an ethicist such as Aristotle is interested in how to conduct oneself, what are the right actions, and how you determine them. And that's what leads Aristotle to focus on virtue and seemingly anchor his virtue ethics in an idea of the beautiful. Kant is more concerned with right intention, the goodwill. I think that's why, that broadly speaking, I think there's ethics that follows from Kant's moral philosophy, but strictly speaking, we would call it morality because it's more focused on rightness of intention than rightness of conduct. And Edwin, I see your hand raised.
Yeah. I just remember from one of the crash course videos that I watched about Kant is that he was raised in a very strict religious family. So I feel that religious norms might be influenced and could be a possibility why Aristotle and him are so different in perspective, but the same on virtue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think while Kant in this reading tries to articulate a moral law based on human capacities alone, it seems very clearly to reflect his Lutheran Christian upbringing. And that could be, it's a question for us, is that a good thing, a bad thing? Is it a weakness? And if so, is it a fatal weakness? We're going to read Nietzsche in a few weeks. Our Nietzsche reading does not include too much of his attack on Kant, but I think a Nietzschean perspective, or even like a basic perspective that's aware of the Kant climate grew up in, would be very aware that Kant's moral philosophy is highly informed by his own Lutheran Christian upbringing. And that's a huge topic unto itself. I think last thing I'll say about it though is that in the excerpts for today and in the rest of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant seems to go out of his way, to me, to show that his moral philosophy is in agreement with passages from the Bible. So I think he would state that there's nothing unchristian about what he's doing. The question is how much is this kind of disguised Christianity, and is that a flaw according to Kant? That's something we'll have to decide on our own. But going back to this idea of the goodwill, staying near the start of the class, it seems like a common human experience that we've encountered. It's considering shoplifting, considering fair jumping, repaying a loan, whatever. A sort of almost internal voice, a conscience saying you should or should not do this. So for Kant, a perfect will would perfectly follow every should and every should not. The problem is we clearly have all kinds of inclinations to do things that we shouldn't. So there's a kind of battle that goes on, Kant seems to suggest, between the power of the will wanting to act morally against natural inclinations for things that we shouldn't want. The candy bar you didn't pay for, or breaking marriage vows, maybe. But I think it's because it's so hard to sort things out in the world of desires and inclinations that Kant makes duty the kind of central criterion of moral conduct. And he'll end up stating that the only gauge of moral worth is whether it's done out of duty. Duty to what, one might ask? Kant has a very interesting approach. It goes back to his critical philosophy, wanting to ground knowledge in reason outside of, before the day-to-day, touchable, feelable, smellable realm. And so in this particular work, he sketches the form a moral law will take before saying it actually exists and trying to prove that it does. So he'll state that if reason has a universal moral law, it can only take this particular form. And this form is the categorical imperative. And just to break down what that term means, because I remember the first time I encountered it, I thought, I'm kind of impressed by this term, not fully clear what it means. But categorical, according to Kant, means unconditional, no ifs, ands, or buts. If there is a moral law, it must apply in all cases at all times with no exceptions. And the imperative part of the categorical imperative, I think, indicates that it's a command conveying not just what, but there's a built-in why of what to do. So one might think of, compare it to other kinds of commands. We can command our pets. Employers try, I think we'll stick to the commanding pets. Dog, sit, heel, fetch, whatever. This is a kind of undignified exchange in which a rational being, or seemingly rational being, is treating another being as something lower. But part of this sort of enlightenment spirit of respecting human dignity and reason is that the moral law, Kant says, if it can be found to exist, must be not just a command, do this or don't do this, don't steal, don't fair jump, do pay your taxes. It has to be not a command, but an imperative, something that respects the status of the person to whom it's addressed as a rational human being. So you can't just say what to a rational creature, you also have to convey the why. And I think that's why Kant uses the term imperative instead of just command. It seems to imply a why in addition to a what. And a key part of the categorical imperative, according to Kant, is that if it exists, and by this stage in the book, he hasn't said it exists, He says, if it exists, it must be a law that human reason gives to itself. I think it's already hopefully become clear that Kant does not think moral law can be founded in the external world. Another thing I'll say in that vein is what's striking about Kant insisting moral law is something that human reason gives to itself is, if we contrast it with things that are both not humans with reason, not in the external world, but the other authorities that we were starting to talk about at the start of class. Kant is looking for a moral law that, going back to Edwin's point, is actually not from the mouth of God, at least not explicitly. So even though there's a lot of specifically Lutheran Christianity, or at least Lutheran Christian themes in Kant, for him, moral law is essentially a rational phenomenon, not a divine one. So starting to say Kant is looking for a moral law that's not based on experience, but occurs in a sense prior to it on the level of reason. He emphasizes that, or just kind of inexplicitly shows that this is not an easy task to do. When we are talking about moral worth, it does not depend on the actions which one sees, but on the inner principles which one does not see. So there's a certain mistrust of outside appearances about conduct. You know, if someone paid back their student loans, did they do it for moral reasons, or was it just to avoid the bad consequences? If someone donated to charity, was it for so-called moral reasons, or was it so they could get likes on social media? So Kant says if there's a moral law, it will be based on something firmer than those kind of external attributes. And I see a comment in the chat. Okay. Everyone says, I see, I'm glad to hear it. And so it's, we could spend a lot of time debating how Kant proves and whether he proves that there is such a thing as the categorical imperative. He seems to suggest that its formulation is the proof. At any rate, he states that the first formulation, do you want to answer it anymore, is this. And who, maybe who hasn't spoken yet, would like to read this quote in the large font up top? Don't be shy, just go for it. Okay, Maya, I see your hand, please.
Act only in accordance with that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law.
Okay, thank you, Maya. So what on earth does that mean? I think it's
only do what you'd be okay with everyone else doing.
I think that is a good way to put it. Anyone else want to, or would you care to elaborate that, or anyone else care to offer an interpretation? And also my question for you, Maya, would be, or for anyone who wants to take a stab at it, is there a difference between this categorical imperative, this formulation of it, and simply saying something like do unto others as you would have done unto yourself?
I was honestly thinking the same thing. So,
right.
I feel like that was the do unto others one is more of like, I guess, like the foundation of a lot of this stuff.
Yes, so there's just a comment in the chat that it's confusing, and I agree. This is not a straightforward statement, and I also find it somewhat confusing. So to start with, the difference between the categorical imperative and do unto others as you would do unto yourself, the golden rule, often called, Kant already seems to be getting at something different, because if you think of the examples he has in mind, and he's going to end up arguing that they're actually these are all duties. There's a duty that if one is well off enough to help others who are struggling, the maxim do unto others as you would have them do unto you will not lead to a duty to always help others if one is in a position to do so, because you could just answer the so-called golden rule by saying, I'm perfectly fine with others not helping me if they're capable of doing it. So Kant, so hopefully if that makes sense, Kant will be trying to get at something different than simply do unto others as they would have done unto you. So to try to get there is to talk about the vocabulary a little bit more. You know, what's a maxim? One of the key words here. I think a way to think about it is it's a private individual reason for a choice, but in Kant's context, it will be often contingent on desires. So, and maybe to evaluate actions and whether they're moral or not, you can kind of convert an action or a behavior into a maxim, extract a maxim from that. So when I board the bus without paying for the trip, I have implicitly asserted the maxim that it is okay for me to board the bus without paying the trip. Where the categorical imperative comes into play is taking that kind of maxim and trying to weigh whether it's universalizable. So when I board a bus without paying, I articulate the maxim, it is okay for me to board the bus without paying. Can that be universalized into basically a law stating it is okay for everyone to board the bus without paying? But I was getting ahead of myself a little bit, because the thrust of the categorical imperative in my interpretation, subject to interpretation as always, is that the categorical imperative in this formulation demands lawfulness itself. Moral law is that you be morally lawful, which when I say it like that might sound circuitous, but I think it will acquire some more kind of heft if we go back to the cases we were talking about earlier. So it's in examples that we could see the categorical imperative, in action, so to speak. So talking about loans, student loans, thousands, if not millions of people who are unable to pay their loans back. Why should they? Kant would state something like, if I take out a loan knowing I will not repay it, I have asserted a maxim that it is okay for me not to repay this loan. But then phrasing it in terms of the categorical imperative, I'm essentially required to see if I can universalize my personal maxim and apply it to all rational beings. The maxim that would result is, it is okay for everyone to take out a loan knowing they cannot repay it. And according to Kant, that is impossible to establish as a universal law. It is not rationally conceivable, because if that were a universal law, there would be no possibility of promise keeping at all. in the universe. So it is an irrational statement. Therefore, the categorical imperative, which requires one to adhere to maxims and only maxims that are capable of being universalized, because you cannot rationally universalize the maxim, it's fine to take out a loan knowing you can't repay it, or at least Kant states that you cannot rationally conceive that on a universal basis. Therefore, fails the kind of test that seems to be coming from the categorical imperative, and there is a duty not to do that. Does that make sense?
In a sense, but I feel like it's sort of like one-sided in a sense,
What do you mean?
where like if you do something, you must, you know, like I don't know. It feels like there's no like sort of like appropriate reaction for anyone else. So like I guess the argument like I would have for like the student loan example, right, is that at least for like our generation growing up, that we were told go to college, go to college, go to college, go to college.
Right.
And so now that we're essentially forced to go to college, we're now forced to take the loan out for the classes.
Yes.
And so if we don't want to pay it, Kant would argue that we're being immoral, even though we were forced to be put in a situation where it'd be hard for us to pay it regardless.
Yeah. I agree that the situation with student loans in the country is basically unfair. I mean, there's just too many people who have taken out too much debt, and in a sense, we're almost tricked at a young age into doing that. However, Kant, so I'm bringing this up so we can understand Kant. Kant would say moral law requires one to pay his or her debts after taking them out, because it is not rationally conceivable to will that everyone take out loans knowing they can't repay them. Evelyn, I see your hand raised.
So I was gonna say something similar. So we can say that morality is more like it's better to apply it in the by when we do it on our own. But for example, when it comes to many institutions, for example, like banks, religion, I don't know, so many other stuff, right? It's like I feel like they're not accountable. They're not accountable for their behavior or morality. For example, why would a bank loan an 18-year-old like so much money when he knows he's not making that much money? Like, and it's like you get them in the system in a way, because of course, if he cannot pay it up, it's gonna build up. So literally, they will not be able to do anything with their life. So you're kind of punishment. Like I feel like you're kind of tricking them to go do something, and then you punish them. And this punishment culture that we have is like very twisted, because they don't even have the experience or the knowledge, and they kind of get caught on it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I agree that the situation with student loans in particular is very unfair. It might actually be immoral on the side of the lenders. I mean, maybe that's a better way to approach this. Trying to apply the categorical imperative to banks. So if a bank consistently gives out loans to people who the bank knows will either struggle or fail to repay them, the bank has created a maxim that says it is okay for me to give out loans even though I know people will be unable to pay them. A universal law resulting from that would be something like, it is okay for everyone, i.e. all banks, to give out loans knowing they are not repayable. I think that from the bank side, they fail the kind of moral test proposed by Kant. So then this raises the real question this is huge, it would be a huge question to me, and maybe a great essay if someone wants to write about it. If both sides of an interaction are morally failing, which is what Kant would say happens when a student takes out a loan knowing they can't repay it, and when a bank gives a loan knowing the student can't repay him. What on earth are you supposed to do with that? Maya, I see your hand raised.
I feel like this, yeah, kind of thinking about this example of like student loan debt, it seems like categorical imperative kind of can lead to like a lack of empathy or understanding, like even just the term categorical imperative, like you have to do this. And like thinking about people who are like against student loan forgiveness because like I had to pay back my loans, you should have to pay back your loans.
Yes.
It just seems like there's kind of a lack of understanding. Like I do sort of get that it's sort of like, well, nobody should be special, nobody should like place themselves in kind of above the categorical imperative, but it also seems like there's not a lot of understanding for people's particular situations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to defend Kant against that. I'm just trying to get us to grasp the categorical imperative. And I think it's rich enough that there's a way to interpret it that it's not just coldly inhuman. The main way for that is going to come when we talk about Kant again next week. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, which, to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, we'll say, to paraphrase, always act so you treat humanity as much in yourself as in other people, always as an end and never as a means. And that is often considered to be Kant kind of bringing some humanity into this very abstract first formulation of the categorical imperative. But setting that aside for now and just talking about the loan situation in terms of the first formulation of the categorical imperative, I mean, the only thing I can think of that Kant might reply to you, Maya, like, I agree that it does not give someone evaluating moral worth of actions any leeway to basically allow for extenuating circumstances and acknowledge, some people just, they were tricked into taking out loans. They didn't know what they were getting into. Or, maybe they have other expenses like, financially helping family. They just can't pay the loans. It comes back to, I think, Kant's point that moral worth should be evaluated solely on the basis of adherence to duty, which I would say in turn springs from the goodwill. But if we leave it just at duty for now and try to bring duty back to the loans, yeah, he'll say it's I mean, there have to be he has to be aware that there's conflicting priorities in life. But yeah, I think if his argument would be, if someone has not paid back loans that they promised to repay, they have failed in their duty. They are not morally worthy in that sense. So that may be very unsatisfying, but does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I don't, I'm not saying I agree, but that's Kant's point of view. Let me ask you, Maya, or anyone else, are there examples where we would agree with a duty based on the categorical imperative? Is there anything that we think always should be done, no ifs, ands, or buts? Okay, Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
I would say, for example, taking care of children's, making sure they're safe. I think regardless of who you are, that should be like a moral duty to make, if you are grown up, to protect a child, or make sure that child is safe.
Yeah. How would you phrase it in Kant's words? We're using some of Kant's words. I mean, I think it would be something, there's a maxim there. Always take care of minors that are dependent on you. And that if I were to act in a way, I mean, I don't have kids, but let's say I hypothetically had kids, and if I said, I'm not gonna pay for their food and clothing this week, I've stated a maxim that it's okay for me sometimes to not pay for my kids' food and clothing, and then bringing the categorical imperative into it, I've thereby asserted it is universally acceptable for parents to sometimes not pay for their kids' food and clothing. I think Kant would agree with what you're saying, Evelyn. I think that he would agree that one has a duty not to sometimes not pay for one's food and clothing, because if one did, that implies it's okay for everyone, and that is an irrational and destructive proposition. Therefore, one has a duty not to do that. Does that make sense? Or did I even get what you're saying right?
It does.
So yeah, I mean, it's trying to evaluate Kant. I mean, I think everyone's brought up great examples, because there's sometimes when the example makes me think Kant doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, the student loan thing is a really hard one. The other example Evelyn just said makes me think that yes, Kant can be, has given us a very powerful moral philosophy. I think hopefully the main sort of aspect of Kant's moral law that I've tried to talk about today is, one, not only is it something that rational beings give to themselves, but it also states moral worth can only be determined by whether an action is done out of duty. And all of this extraneous stuff is irrelevant. So next week, we're going to talk about the other formulations of the categorical imperative, which I think will give some more depth to it. There's one I already mentioned in passing when talking about Maya's question. So I personally love talking about this stuff. I'm going to look forward to our conversation next week.